Wansdyke is one of the great linear bank and ditch earthworks of England. Named after the Norse god Woden, it stretches 35 miles across Somerset and Wiltshire, admittedly with a big gap in the middle. Only the Devil's Dyke near Newmarket is higher. It has been described as a formidable barrier, yet it is not nearly as well known, for example, as that other great linear earthwork on the English-Welsh border, Offa's Dyke, with which it is sometimes confused. Puzzled about what it was for, and being unable to find a book about it, I decided to find out more. I ended up writing a book about it. There are two sections of Wansdyke. West Wansdyke stretches from Maze Knoll to the south of Bristol to the south-east edge of Bath. East Wansdyke runs from Morgan's Hill near Devizes, stopping short of the western edge of Savernake Forest south of Marlborough. Today this is the grander section. In between is a 14-mile gap, largely taken up by the Bath to Silchester Roman road. Being built on a bank or agger, this was originally thought to be part of Wansdyke, but excavations by Tony Clark at Sandy Lane in Wiltshire in the 1950s demonstrated that it was not. This begs the question of whether the two earthworks are part of the same overall structure. Sir Cyril and Lady Aileen Fox, in their seminal study of the monument in the 1950s, Wansdyke Reconsidered, declared that they were not. But the fact that both sections have broadly similar structures, are mentioned in similar terms in a number of 10th century land charters, and are on a very similar alignment, strongly suggests that they are part of the same structure. Both sections have their bank to the south and the ditch to the north, often with a smaller counterscarp bank to the north of the ditch, and this configuration indicates that it was built by the people living to its south. We also know that it was built sometime between the late Roman period and the year 903 AD, when it is first mentioned by name in a land charter, but it has yet to be more closely dated. At one time it was thought that because of its Anglo-Saxon name it must have been built before the people of Wessex converted to Christianity, which Bede tells us was in 635 AD, when King Cyngils was baptized by Birinus. However, Andrew Reynolds, Professor of Medieval Archaeology at University College London, has pointed out that Alfred the Great, who was very strongly Christian and reigned well after this date, counted Woden among his ancestors, according to his biographer Bishop Asser, which tends to render this theory redundant. One of the reasons that the earthwork has not been more closely dated is that by its nature it is a boundary feature, which avoids the type of places that often yield good archaeology, like settlements with their workshop and cemeteries. Radiocarbon dates have been obtained from both West and East Wansdyke, but they give dates ranging from 1000 BC to 1160 AD. These are not only very different from each other, but outside the likely date range identified above. The conclusion is that the dates were obtained from material which was not contemporary with the construction of the dyke, and they do not seem to help with dating. The approach I have taken is to look at the question from a sub-regional perspective, by using archaeological and historical sources to build up a picture of how Somerset and Wiltshire developed between the end of Roman Britain and the 10th century. It is possible to identify periods when construction of a north-facing earthwork was simply not relevant to the strategic issues being faced by the local inhabitants, and therefore unlikely to have resulted in its construction at that particular time. This allows the time frame for construction of the earthwork to be narrowed down considerably. But before delving into this, let's have a closer look at the features of the earthwork. In Wansdyke Reconsidered, the Foxes identified 3 distinct sections. The grandest section was the western part of East Wansdyke, where it crosses the Marlborough Downs. Here the bank is frequently 3 metres above ground level, with the combined height of bank and ditch often exceeding 7 metres, and a counterscarp as high as 1.2 metres in places. East of Shore House, where the earthwork comes off the high ground, it decreases in height, with the bank about 1.4 metres high and a ditch 1 metre deep. However, Peter Fowler's study of the earthwork in West Woods, south of Marlborough, undertaken in the late 1990s, showed that the bank seemed to be at different stages of construction, and he concluded that this section was unfinished. He also concluded that there were a regular series of gates in this part of the earthwork, seemingly designed to concentrate movement into this part of the dyke. He likened them to mile castles on Hadrian's Wall. Some of these gates are described in Anglo-Saxon land charters. West Wansdyke is of similar dimensions to the eastern part of East Wansdyke. It crosses a complex landscape according to the Foxes. It contains gaps and seemingly does not follow the militarily best line. The Foxes concluded that it was constructed by people who were not free to choose their line. West Wansdyke has suffered far more than East Wansdyke from the ravages of ploughing. Some of the gaps can be attributed to this, but careful excavation by the West Wansdyke project in 1996 showed that some gaps had never been filled, perhaps endorsing Peter Fowler's conclusion that the earthwork was unfinished. The earthwork did not have a berm, a flat area between the bank and ditch, which could be used to place obstacles to disrupt an attack. There was also no sign of a patrol track or quarters to station observers. Excavations on East Wansdyke have shown no evidence of revetments, but on West Wansdyke evidence of revetments of both timber and stone has been found. Something that was common to many of the excavations was a dark seam running upwards towards the front of the bank. This was most likely caused by a layer of grass decaying after being buried, and is evidence that the bank was constructed in more than one stage, the interpretation being that the builders of Wansdyke used pre-existing dykes where they could, possibly in an opportunistic manner. Stephen Green's excavations between 1966 and 1970 at Red Shore on East Wansdyke concluded that the earthwork had a very short life. This conclusion was reached by noting a layer of flint and humus located near the bottom of the ditch. Assuming that this layer was generated when the adjoining field was cleared for agricultural use, this seemed to indicate that this happened fairly soon after the bank was constructed, possibly as little as 5 years. Finds from all the excavations that have taken place over the years have been few and far between. The most important finds still remain those from Lieutenant General Augustus Pitt Rivers' excavations on East Wansdyke of 1889 and 1890. After an inconclusive excavation in 1889, he carried out a second excavation at a place he called Brown's Barn. Here there was evidence of a settlement. This was the kind of situation that had proved so profitable to Pitt Rivers when excavating at Bokerley Dyke on the Dorset-Hampshire border, where finds of coinage had enabled him to date the construction quite closely. These excavations were crucial to his campaign at Wansdyke. At Brown's Barn, his meticulous excavations uncovered a nail and a cleat from a sandal on the original surface line. These were similar to those found at Bokerley, but because there he was able to link them with coinage, he could date them with confidence as being late Roman. A less experienced and meticulous excavator might not have been able to identify and date them, or might have missed them altogether. His conclusion was that the earthwork's Roman or post-Roman origin had been satisfactorily determined. This turned the established theories on their head, as the noted antiquarians William Stukely and Sir Richard Colt Hoare had believed the earthwork to have been built by the Belgae in the Iron Age. There is a considerable amount of disagreement about where the bank starts and finishes. It is now pretty much agreed that the Roman road in the middle section is not part of the earthwork, though it might nevertheless have formed part of the boundary, as it was an easily identifiable line in the landscape, and it joins directly onto the western end of East Wansdyke. A much grander monument, stretching from Porter's Head on the Bristol Channel to somewhere near Andover in Hampshire, has been proposed by antiquarians and early 20th century archaeologists. Today, the most significant disagreements concern a western extension to West Wansdyke and an eastern extension to East Wansdyke. In 1998, Keith Gardner proposed a northward extension to West Wansdyke. Maze Knoll is at the eastern end of Dundry Hill, which forms a major topographical barrier across the south of Bristol. The proposal was for a northern extension from the other end of Dundry Hill northwards to the Avon Gorge at Stokely Camp, close to the present-day location of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. A section of bank on the western flank of Dundry Hill could be part of the earthwork. At Long Ashton, close to the foot of the hill, two charters from the reign of Edward II describe a local road, Yanley Lane, as Wander's Ditch. Linear outworks to Stokely Camp could be interpreted as the terminal of a linear bank. This would make sense inasmuch as this would take the earthwork to the highly defensible position of the Avon Gorge, and would defend the vulnerable Ashton Vale, which in post-Roman times was the location of the Roman settlement of Gatcombe and the reoccupied hill fort of Cadbury Congsbury. However, Keith Gardner did not consider this evidence as irrefutable proof of a westward extension. A possible eastern extension of East Wansdyke also has much evidence both for and against it. The eastern terminal of East Wansdyke is in the middle of nowhere, at a location known as New Buildings. Sir Cyril and Lady Aileen Fox were quite clear that the earthwork terminated here. However, over 200 years ago, when Sir Richard Colt Hoare had investigated the line of the dyke, he was convinced that it extended to Inkpen Beacon, close to where the counties of Wiltshire, Berkshire and Hampshire meet, and possibly onwards to Silchester, though he had found no trace of this section. He had identified various sections of bank which could be part of the earthwork. Inconclusive excavations failed to prove the existence of Wansdyke beyond New Buildings, and the general view was that it ended there, close to the boundary of what would later become the Kinwoodstone 100. Recently, Alexander Langlands of Swansea University has studied land charters from this 100 and has identified a series of gates referred to in them, similar in concept to those identified by Peter Fowler in West Woods. This is significant to the concept of a maximum view of Wansdyke proposed by Langlands and Andrew Reynolds as a boundary between Wessex and Mercia, of which more later. Two other pieces of evidence need to be looked at. First, at Morgan's Hill at the western terminus of East Wansdyke, the earthwork meets the Roman road from Bath to Silchester. In the 18th century, William Stukely observed that the road cut the bank, proving that the bank had existed before the Romans arrived. He concluded that it was built by the Belgae, who we now refer to as the Atrebates, a Belgic tribe who settled here in the late Iron Age. The Foxes declared Stukely to have been deceived. The bank cut the road and effectively put it out of action at this point, proving that it post-dated the Romans. The evidence is not clear-cut, as the present track which follows the Roman road appears to be at a higher level than the Roman road was. However, Pitt River's dating evidence shows that the Foxes must have been correct. Second, there is the complex issue of parish boundaries. Desmond Bonney of the Royal Commission of Historic Monuments, Salisbury, produced an investigation of parish boundaries in relation to Wansdyke in the 1960s and 1970s, which showed that Wansdyke bore almost no relation to parish boundaries, whereas the Roman road separating the two sections of the earthwork formed parish boundaries along most of its length, and still does today. He argued that Wansdyke must therefore have been built after the parish boundaries were defined, as otherwise they would surely have followed it. Bonney showed that elsewhere in Wiltshire parish boundaries follow Grimsdyke, and may therefore have their origins in the Iron Age. Reynolds and Langlands proposed that parish boundaries were defined no earlier than the 9th century AD, on the basis of the number of land charters granting small parcels of land dating from the 9th to the 12th centuries. Others argue that the ephemeral nature of Wansdyke was the reason it never became a political boundary, though its physical presence on the ground even today is anything but ephemeral. So we have quite a lot of evidence, mostly inconclusive, but this only allows us to define a period of over 500 years as the period within which Wansdyke was constructed. This was a time of great change, starting with the Romans and ending when the Vikings were in possession of large parts of England. In the absence of more secure dating evidence by archaeology, examining the archaeological and historical context of the earthwork on a sub-regional basis can tell us more about when it could have been built and why. The late 4th century seems to have been an unstable period in Britain. The Roman Empire was beginning what proved to be its terminal decline here. In Wiltshire and Somerset there is evidence of the refortification of Cunetio, the Roman settlement near Marlborough, and Gatcombe southwest of Bristol in this period, perhaps connected to the barbarian conspiracy of 367 AD, when Ammianus tells us that the Picts, Scots and Attocotti began attacking and plundering from the north. Also noticeable are a number of villa fires, occurring in the late 4th century in areas close to West Wansdyke and the Roman road particularly. The southwest of the country is also notable for the number of unretrieved coin hoards. As the 4th century moved into the 5th and the Romans departed, Roman civitates may have re-armed and become combatants. The British monk Gildas tells us in his De Excidio of the British people at this time as weak in beating off the weapons of the enemy, but strong in putting up with civil war. All that we know about the location of these civitates is contained in Ptolemy's Geographia, produced in the 2nd century AD, according to which North Somerset and Wiltshire were part of the civitas of the Belgae. He does not describe its boundaries, but identifies 3 locations within it: Venta Belgarum, Winchester; Aqua Calidae, believed to be Bath; and Iscalis, possibly uphill at the mouth of the River Axe, and almost certainly connected to the important silver and lead mines at Charterhouse on the Mendips. The civitas was located between the Dobunny and the Duratriges, and west of the Atrebates. These other civitates can be linked to the coinage of Iron Age tribes, but the Belgae can't, so it is postulated that it was a Roman creation, carved out of the Iron Age kingdom of the Atrebates, specifically designed to control the Mendip mines. Others have argued that Ptolemy was mistaken and North Somerset would not have been part of the Civitas, as it is too far from Winchester and the only part of the Civitas not formally part of the kingdom of the Atrebates. However, Ptolemy's position is clear. The Civitas as defined by him would have contained both sections of Wansdyke at or near its northern boundary with the Dobunny. In From Roman Civitas to Anglo-Saxon Shire, the late Bruce Eagle's sweeping assessment of the birth of Wessex, he detects slight differences in the archaeology within the Kinward Stone Hundred and outside it, on the basis of which he suggests that its western and southern boundaries may have formed the boundary between the Atrebates and the Belgae, in the process placing the eastern end of Wansdyke at New Buildings very much on the edge of Belgic territory, and possibly explaining why it stopped there. After about 450 AD things begin to change. Bruce Eagles identifies this as the time when the Durotriges must have invaded North Somerset, as after this the archaeology starts to link them to the far southwest. Iron Age hill forts start to be reoccupied, as shown in classic excavations at South Cadbury by Leslie Alcock and Cadbury Congsbury by Philip Ratz and Ian Burrow, the latter being well within Belgic territory as defined by Ptolemy. Evidence was found of imported goods from the Mediterranean, almost certainly linking the area to Tintagel in Cornwall. The area seems to be part of a trading network running up the southwest peninsula, but not including areas further east such as Wiltshire or Dorset, nor extending north of the River Avon. As Eagles observes, in comparison with the Civitates of the Atrebates and the Belgae, the material culture and archaeology of the Durotriges could not look more different in the 5th century. Meanwhile, the Saxons were beginning to make their presence felt in Wiltshire, though not much before 500 AD. Anglo-Saxon cemeteries begin to appear at Petersfinger, Harnham and Winterbourne Gunner in South Wiltshire and Pewsey in central East Wiltshire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle talks of the Surdisings, Cerdic and his descendants, moving northwards from the south coast at the beginning of the 6th century and taking control of Wessex. At the same time, there seems to have been a movement from the Upper Thames Valley westwards. About 500 AD, the Battle of Mount Badon took place. Described by Gildas, it tells us of the British winning a notable victory against the Anglo-Saxons under Ambrosius Aurelianus, with the help, tradition has it, of King Arthur. After this, there was a generation of peace. Very plausibly, Eagles suggests a boundary between the British, the Durotriges, and the emerging territory of Wessex was drawn up along the Forest of Selwood, roughly along the present-day boundary between Somerset and Wiltshire. This was a north-south cultural and political boundary between the British and the Anglo-Saxons, and it is difficult to see the relevance of Wansdyke in this scenario. It was an east-west north-facing boundary, half on the British side and half on the Anglo-Saxon side of Selwood. In fact, this peace may have lasted until the 7th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that in 658 AD, Cenwalh, king of Wessex, defeated the Welsh, that is the Durotriges, at Paonum, thought to be Pen Selwood on the Somerset-Wiltshire boundary, and drove them back to the River Parrett. Thus began the process of annexing Somerset by Wessex, and the end of the British kingdom. I would argue that it is unlikely that Wansdyke was constructed during this period, that is, between about 450 and 660 AD. Now a different scenario comes into play, conflict between Wessex and Mercia, which had been ongoing at least since Penda, king of Mercia, defeated Wessex at Cirencester in 628 AD. It would continue throughout the 8th century. It was probably ended by the Battle of Chelmsford in 802 AD, when Wessex seems to have expelled Mercia from its territory permanently. From then on, Wessex seems to have had the upper hand in the relationship between the two kingdoms. In addition, we have a land charter of 825 AD, probably a later forgery, but possibly based on historical evidence, which refers to their Eldon Dyke, the Old Dyke. As the land in question was crossed by Wansdyke, this is taken as a reference to Wansdyke. In the 9th century, Mercia in particular had other things on its mind, with the invasion of the Vikings, which actually at one point led them to ally themselves with Wessex. We can therefore probably rule out the 9th century as a time when Wansdyke was built. And that brings us to the charter evidence of 903 AD and the end of our historical survey. Out of this we can identify two scenarios which would fit the archaeological and historical context. First, there is civil war between the Belgae and the Dobunni during or after the breakup of the Roman Empire. This could have taken place between about 350 and 450 AD, after which it is suggested that the Belgae lost North Somerset to the Durotriges. This was a popular scenario among archaeologists in the late 20th century. Second, we have the earthwork playing a role in the ongoing conflict between Wessex and Mercia between, say, 660 and 800 AD. This is proposed by Andrew Reynolds and Alex Langlands as a maximum view of Wansdyke, which has it as part of a longer frontier between the two kingdoms, stretching from the Bristol Channel to at least Silchester, though much of it was never built. Reynolds favours the end of the period, when two powerful kings faced each other across this boundary, Offa of Mercia and Cynewulf of Wessex. Clearly, only further archaeological investigation will finally settle this matter. Given the paucity of finds from previous excavations, a technique based on soil analysis, most likely optically stimulated luminescence, seems like the way forward. In the meantime, Wansdyke should not be ignored for lack of close dating evidence, but needs to be recognised for the important and dramatic monument that it is and the important role it may have played in our early history. The Quest for Wansdyke is published by the Hobnob Press, price £14.95.